Good morning.
Hold on. Make sure Wayne's starting.
Good to see everybody. Well, I'll tell Wayne to start here in a second. I don't see everybody on here. Who am I missing?
It appears Dr. Capilouto is not here. It appears Chris Brown is not here.
I'm here.
Oh, there's Dr.
Oh,
there he is.
There you are. Hey, how are
I
you?
do not see Chris Brown, but I see Beverly Schneller, who I think works for him. She may just be listening.
Gary Tipton. I see Senator Givens. Senator Givens, hello.
I'm here.
Morning.
Well, Wayne, are you ready to start? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see everybody. This is our third meeting of the Performance Funding Working Group Review. It's good to have everybody. We've got a fairly large agenda today, and we'll try to get through it as much as we can, but there may be some left over for next time. Just kind of lay it out what our hopes are. We've now received information, I think, from everybody on the good and the bad and the uglies of the performance funding work group. And we're going to go through and talk about some of those. Bill's going to give us some upfront stuff, but then in the middle, Sean's doing a small strengths and weaknesses based on what everyone has said. We have identified those that have made those statements just so everybody will have an opportunity to talk about it. But in the middle of that, we're going to just take time and start having our discussion during that time. We are also going to try to get to the end, by the end of the day, at least some of the things we possibly can agree on, or at least think about agreeing on as we move forward into the next sessions. So I'm not going to take a lot of time. I will come back in the middle of the conversation and maybe add a couple other items, and please feel free, everybody, to do the same. I'm going to ask Heather to take the roll for the official proceedings, though.
Absolutely. President Thompson.
Here.
Budget Director Hicks.
Here.
Senator Givens.
I'm here.
Representative Tipton. President McFadden. Here. President Brown.
Yes, present.
President, well, I was getting ready to say President Box, but he's not here. I need to know how to say your last name.
Sarah Bottom.
Okay. I will get trained on that and get it right for next time, but I'll mark you as here. President Morgan.
Here.
President Jackson.
30 more seconds.
President Vaidea.
Here.
President Capilouto.
Here.
President Bendaputi.
Here.
President Gaboni.
Here.
Great. All right. Have a great meeting, y'all.
Thank you, Heather. If you look at the agenda for the day, the first thing we're going to talk about are the financial impact studies that we've done for the public universities as well as KCTCS. The next section, which I mentioned earlier, we will talk about how the model has been functioning. We'll also talk about unintended consequences and, as I said earlier, recommended adjustments. And I would really like for you all to feel free to have the kind of conversations we really need to have to kind of get to a point whereby we will see at least some recommendations coming out of it, this meeting and the next couple of meetings, whereby we'll have it ready in December. This says review MUSU proposal. It's really not a Murray proposal. Bob Jackson, as the convener of the presidents, was asked to put together a few things. I looked at it, several other presidents, and we moved it forward to the other presidents to look at, and you've given us feedback. So we just have that there as a statement. Not really, it's not a Murray proposal, but we'll review that also. So when we get to the point of number 3 and 4, this is when we'll have most of our discussion. Toward the end, we will talk about other business and then adjournment. Any questions before I ask Bill to go into number 2? If not, Bill, why don't you start, please?
Okay. As President Thompson indicated, we've got 3 major components of the agenda. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes and try to get through this quickly about some financial impact information, both for the public universities and KCTCS. And as he said, Sean is going to be sharing some slides that sort of summarize some information that was provided in the campus summary statements. Heather, if you'll go to the next slide. This table shows the change in state funds for educating students between fiscal years 2016-17 and 2021. Obviously, the first column of numbers is fiscal 2016-17, and the second column is 2020-21, and you can see the dollar change and percent change figures. If you look at the footnote at the bottom, we're defining state funds for educating students as each institution's regular general fund appropriation plus any performance fund distribution in that year, minus debt service and minus mandated program funding. If you look at the dollar change and the percent change figures, you can see that there are 3 institutions that had positive dollar and percent changes between 2017 and 2021. And that was UK, Northern, and Western Kentucky University. I do want to point out in the upper right-hand corner of the slide that note in red font so that everyone is aware. These figures show the combined impact of both budget cuts, a 1% mid-year budget cut in 2017-18, and then an enacted reduction of 6.25% in 2018-19. And just to refresh everyone's memory, it was $54.3 million in total for the system for that 6.25% enacted reduction, but the General Assembly did put $31 million in additional funding into the Post-Secondary Education Performance Fund in that year. And so some of that 6.25% reduction was restored. But for some institutions like Kentucky State University, Morehead State University, that did not receive any distribution out of that $31 million, they took the full brunt of that 6.25% cut. I think it's important to point out that had there been no budget cuts over this time period, the largest negative percent change that we would have expected to see over this time period would have been 3%. Because as I think everyone on this call knows, we had a 3-year phase-in for the model. In the first year, it would have been a 0% or hold harmless year, so no funding would have been redistributed among institutions. In the second year of the phase-in, we had a 1% stop loss. And then in this most recent year, 2020-21, we had a 2% stop loss. And so what you're seeing here in terms of those dollar changes and percent changes, particularly for institutions like Kentucky State and Morehead, is that they're getting hit not only with the budget cuts, but also the loss of their stop loss contributions. Okay.
Bill?
Yes.
This is Eli, excuse me. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is such that the adjustments for Northern and Western were really not a function of the model performance, but some rebalancing on some inequities that started before we really fully implemented the performance funding model. Is my memory correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That was in the second year of the 2016-18 biennium, my memory, it serves me correctly, it was around $5 million for Northern Kentucky University, $2.5 million for Western. And those were additional appropriations in the budget bill that were not as a result of the performance funding model. So you're absolutely correct, President Capilouto.
Thank you.
Any other questions about this slide?
Bill, this is John Hicks. If after the meeting, if you could modify that slide to adjust for the those two adjustments, just to see what the percentage and dollar effect is only for the model and for the cuts. Thanks.
Yeah, and we've got some information that we're still in the process of validating with the CBOs that isolate the impact of the performance funding model itself. And so we will absolutely do that and bring that information at the next meeting. Next slide, Heather. Okay, this slide takes the information that you saw on the previous page, and it just shows the change in the percent share of state funds for educating students. The first column of numbers, of course, is the fiscal 2016-17% share. And that's just the percent of total. Each institution's state fund appropriation divided by the total for the system. The second column of numbers is the fiscal 2020-21% share. And then that third column is the percentage point difference. As you can see, again, looking at that third column of numbers, you've got three institutions that had a positive percentage point difference in terms of their share of state funds for educating students. And just, again, to refresh everybody's memory, the way that this funding model works for any given metric, if an institution has a growth rate that exceeds the growth rate of the public university average, then for that particular metric, it's going to increase their share of funding. And so this is, in my mind, showing that the model is working as intended because institutions that have been progressing more students, producing more degrees, are seeing their shares of funding increase. So go to the next slide, Heather. I thought this chart was very interesting, and this was actually one of our presidents and a couple of CBOs asked that we put this chart together. And just so you know, this isn't exactly the same time period. This is state funds for educating students on a per full-time equivalent student basis for the public universities. And this, again, has the same start year, fiscal year 2016-17, but it goes through 2019-20. Our fall semester 2020 enrollment data are not final yet. I'm told by our data and analytics folks that in early November, we should have final fall enrollment. So at our next meeting, hopefully we'll be able to bring an updated table that shows the time period 16-17 through 2021. A couple of things jump out at me when I look at this table. First of all, it's as I expected. Because the University of Kentucky and Northern Kentucky University and Western Kentucky University had increases in their state funds for educating students, I expected to see increases in their funding per FTE in 2019-20. And oh, by the way, of course, the blue bars are 2016-17 per student funding, and the red bars are 2019-20 per student funding. So you do see increases in those three institutions. But at the same time, you see increases at Eastern Kentucky University, Morehead State University, and Murray State University. And those increases in per student funding are not as a result of increases in state funds, but decreases in enrollment over this time period. Another thing that's interesting to me is that UK on a per student basis is funded at a lower level than the University of Louisville, but that gap has narrowed over this time period. And then also the per student funding at Northern and Western is still below that of the other comprehensive universities. So are there any questions about this particular slide?
Bill, I have a quick question. In regard to this chart, how would it look and would a secondary chart be helpful in regard to total public funds and taking in account the difference in tuition? You know, some are very low tuition and some are much higher tuition rates, just to look at what the total public funds issue looks like for each institution?
Yeah, we would be glad to put that together. And President Jackson, something else that I thought about actually as I was driving in this morning. As you know, and I think the rest of the folks on this call know, in the funding model, there's actually a 50% weighting for out-of-state students. So I would like to do this same exact calculation, but instead of that 1-to-1 ratio for in-state and out-of-state students using total FTE, just to see what it would look like, I would like to do a 50% weighting of the out-of-state students. And I'll bring that information to the working group at our next meeting as well.
Well, this is Tim Caboni. One of the things you dropped out there for a second, at least on my connection. And I do think that the relationship between enrollment declines and gains in FTE is another important thing to be able to tease out. I mean, that's obviously not a strategy that anyone would pursue to grow per FTE funding. But if there's a way to kind of tease that out as well, I think that would be valuable because it's, again, not model related.
No, you're absolutely correct. And that's one reason we've included this next slide is we wanted to make sure that everyone on the call realized that for a number of our institutions, they didn't actually have an increase in funding. If you'll go to the next slide, Heather.
Bill, before you do that, just this is Ashish Vaidya from NKU. Just to reemphasize the point, I think that even Eli made a few minutes earlier about the increase that we saw at Northern Kentucky University was primarily because of that. If you do go back to the slide, you'll see the discrepancy in per state funding per FTE prior to that change was even more dramatic for Northern Kentucky University. There's been a slight movement in the right direction, but we were below even $4,000 per FTE in the 2016-17 fiscal year. And that gap between that and any of the other institutions was fairly significant.
Right.
It perhaps has narrowed somewhat relative to certainly Western, but not clearly. I would be remiss if I didn't say that that's an area that we would certainly like to see some additional movement based on this. This is a pretty national standard approach that, as you know, SHIO and others do on a routine basis, Bill, that compares what is the state appropriations per FTE funding across different states, and what is the average across not only our Midwestern region and perhaps national as well. And it may not be a bad idea to add to the fact, especially for some of the folks that may not be fully aware, that the national average, I think, is significantly higher. I think it's over 7,000 plus per FTE across state institutions in most countries. And probably Aaron has some of that information because he's in those national conversations on a routine basis. So I just wanted to make sure that this is pretty relevant information that certainly our General Assembly should be aware of as well.
If I could dovetail on what Ashish was saying too, since we're the other institution affected by that adjustment from the legislature, I do think that if the goal was to make per FTE more equitable, then we've made a bit of a shift in the right direction, but I'm not sure the model has gotten us to where we wanted to be. And I know that Bill, there was that adjustment. Did we get all of the adjustments we needed to get to parity or?
Well, that's why I was saying that looking at this same chart and instead of using the total FTE without any weighting between in-state and out-of-state, that's why there looks like there's disparity in funding, at least among the comprehensive institutions. I suspect if you apply a 50% weighting to the FTE that are coming from out of state and do these same calculations, you're going to see the funding per FTE among the comprehensive institutions come closer to parity. It's that weighting, and as you know, in the performance funding model, 35 is distributed based on earned credit hours. Well, those earned credit hours are counted with a weighting of 1 if they're in-state students, but they're counted at a 50% weighting if they're out-of-state students. And so what you're looking at here is total FTE and not a reduced weighting for out-of-state. So that's why I want to do that second chart that gives us an idea of what that would look like. And of course, that's a couple of institutions have suggested that we revisit the weighting for out-of-state students. In our tuition and fee policy, we've made it more flexible for institutions to try to recruit out-of-state students through lower tuition. And yet, if we have a 50% weighting in terms of the reward in the funding model for earned credit hours, that seems to run counter to the approach that we're taking on the tuition side. And so that's something that one of the institutions brought up, and the presidents can discuss that when we get to that point.
And Bill, again, I think that there would be a stabilization or a different picture painted with total public funds if we looked at that component too, because of differentiation of tuition and other fees that are calculated in this process as well.
Yes, sir.
Bill, this is Senator Givens. I want to weigh in on this slide because it seems like this slide has gotten a lot of attention from a lot of folks, and very rightly so. It often goes without saying, but it feels comfortable to remind all of us of these sorts of things. You mentioned that the declining enrollment, changing that denominator for these institutions, has factored into the slide you've presented to us, correct?
Yes.
I think it's again, it goes without saying, but we all need to be reminded the way the formula works. You can take a snapshot in time at any point and put up a slide that's informative and helpful. But if your enrollment's declining, you're going to suffer in the future years because you're going to award fewer degrees. And so it all impacts in different ways. That was all I wanted to drive home.
May I ask one quick question? This,
Yes.
never mind. It's on the, I'm good. Thank you.
Senator Givens, I want to add one other point to a point you just made. You'll suffer in future years with awarding less degrees, but you also suffer formatively because you won't have the progression. You'll have, you can get more percentage-wise of the people that you have to take 30, 60, or 90 hours, but what you'll have in the early 30 hours, let's say, you'll have fewer people. So that's exactly correct. In the future years, you'll suffer maybe a bigger dollar loss, but you'll suffer some dollar loss even in the process.
Well, and one caveat to that, and I think everyone on this call knows this, if an institution has a slight decline in enrollment, but actually increases their retention rates and their graduation rates, that can offset, the impact of that decline in enrollment. Next slide, Heather.
Bill, one other clarification I'd like to make. I believe the legislation required that the funding formula reflect differences in missions and cost structures.
Correct.
That mostly all of our metrics are keyed around undergraduate education because that is what we all commonly share and do. In recognition of the fact that Louisville and Kentucky, have quite expensive professional PhD and other, health programs. That dollar, I imagine, reflects that recognition. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, sir. This slide shows the trend in FTE student enrollment for the public universities. The slide on the left shows the aggregate trend in full-time equivalent enrollment, and the slide on the right shows a breakout between the research universities and the comprehensive universities. As you can see, looking at the slide on the left, in fall of 2015, over this time period, the peak was at 106, 718 students. And then for 4 straight years, we've seen decreases in FTE student enrollment. And over this time period, for the public universities in total, you're down 5,544 students, or 5%. That's an average annual decrease of about 1% per year. The chart on the right, again, as I said, this is full-time equivalent student enrollment by sector for the same time period, 2013 through 2019. The blue line represents the comprehensive university FTE, and the red line is the research university FTE. And you can see in the comprehensive sector, they're down close to 6,000 students, or 10% over this time period. And the research universities on average are up 407 students, or about 1% over this 6-year period. I think it's important to note, as you can see in the bullet in the upper right-hand corner, UK is the only university over this time period that actually had an increase in their FTE student enrollment of about 951 students, or 3.4%.
Bill, it's Tim Caboni again. One of the things that I think might be important on this slide, since we think about the P through 20 system instead of just four-year institutions as a subsegment, the relationship between this and the growth in two-year institution enrollment, I would imagine, over time. So I do think that there may be a shifting of enrollment patterns in a way that disadvantages or reduces the number of folks at comprehensives, but it might be offset by growth in two-year institution enrollment. So I think that's important to put in there.
Yes, sir. And the reason I included this slide is I didn't want people to look at the previous slide and think, well, just about all of our institutions have had increases in funding, because it is the decline in enrollment for some of the institutions that are driving that increase in per FTE funding. Next slide, Heather. I'm going to go through these next couple of slides quickly. This is the same information as the first two tables, only it shows the detail for KCTCS. Again, it's the change in state funds for educating students. And if you look at the dollar and percent changes over to the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that 8 KCTCS institutions had positive dollar and percent changes in state funds over this period, and 8 had negative dollar and percent changes. And again, you know, these numbers reflect those 2 budget cuts that we mentioned earlier, as well as redistribution of funds as a result of the performance funding model. As you can see, the institution with the largest dollar and percent decrease in state funds over this period was Hazard Community College with minus 1.35 million and about an 11% reduction. And the institution with the largest dollar and percent increase in state funds was South Central with an increase of around $1 million, or a 12.3% increase.
Bill, let me add something based on what President Caboni said. If you look at our KCTCS institutions, we've been decreasing in enrollment, although really increasing in the student success outputs in those areas. So that, you know, our comprehensives, as they have fallen in enrollment, so have our community and technical colleges. So this is due to several factors I just want to throw in. One is we have a declining number of students graduating from high school, but we also are decreasing, last year, as an example, 2 full percentage points of those that graduated from high school going on to college. And then those that were really transition ready coming out of high school was about 51% too. So there are a lot of other factors that are causing this, Tim, other than shifting of enrollment to other institutions. So, and there's some other issues too that we could throw in there, but that's what you'll see with KCTCS. They've done a really good job of increasing overall graduation outputs by comparison to their baseline, but they've also decreased in enrollment in comparison to their baseline.
Aaron, can I jump in on that too? Because I think if you're looking at this only from a statewide perspective, that makes perfect sense. But if you just begin to disaggregate and think about the smaller competitive marketplaces in which we live, we know our overlap group includes the local community college, and we've seen a shifting from in that first year a little bit over time to folks starting a 2-year and doing transfer. And so again, in the aggregate, it's one thing, but when you focus in on a competitive space, I think there are some shifts that are happening.
You're right, Tim. South Central has done a really good job in enrollment too, to make your point really clear. Yes, and you'll see with West Kentucky, South Central, some of those 2-year institutions have really done a really good job. And there you will see some shifting, especially Western. who used to have the Bowling Green Community College as a part of your campus. So that's the other real example that you're doing.
Well,
This is Bob Jackson. One thing that may be instructive for all of us also is to look at high school graduates now and for the next 5 years, to put this in perspective for others, especially our legislators and our colleagues there as they look at this information. I think it will paint a slightly different picture also.
I want to ask Bill this question. The way the understanding of the model for me is in some ways you're competing against yourself, because we involve sort of percentage changes across metrics. If on average, we went up on these metrics 7%, but a particular university went up 10%, you'd get a greater share of whatever funds are available. On the other hand, if we have this secular decline in high school graduates and whatever, and it's reflected across all our institutions, if we went down on average by 10%, but your university went down only 5%, the model still works in that you'd get the one that went down only 5% would get a greater share of the available dollars. Is that a way to look at this, Bill?
you're absolutely correct.
So there are adjustments in here that take into account secular declines for issues like high school graduates.
Eli, that's especially true if you get the in-state, the way the model works now with 50% out of state, 100% for in-state. That's especially true if you get the in-state student.
Thanks, Eric.
Bill, I think in regard to Eli's comment, is that works if there's new money in the model.
Right, and that's actually a perfect segue. President Thompson was giving kudos to the KCTCS institutions, and I think our public universities are to be commended. When you look at the state funds for educating students in 16-17, 759 million, and then in the current year, 749 million. There's been a loss of $9.3 million over this time period. But as you may recall from 2 meetings ago, our bachelor's degree production is up about 24%, STEM plus H and URM bachelor's degree production up 28%, 30%. And so our institutions are really to be commended for the production of those degrees in the face of less state dollars to help, support that degree production. Wendell Followell, are you on the phone, or anyone from KCTCS? Do you want to make any comments about this slide before we move on?
No, I think you've covered it very well, Bill. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Next slide, Heather. And I'm not going to go into any amount of time on this slide. Again, this is just showing the percent share in 16-17 and 2021 and the percentage point difference for the KCTCS institutions. President Thompson, unless there's any other comments or questions, I'm ready to hand this over to Sean to take the next section.
That's fine, Bill. I will come back. I'm looking for some data. I just got some brand new data that I presented yesterday on some 2020 data, but go to the next slide. Areas, Sean, I may interrupt you just to give some updated information to this group.
Good morning, everyone. After the last performance funding work group meeting, we asked each of the institutions to submit a statement discussing their view as to which aspects of the funding were working as intended, if identified unintended consequences from the model, and if they have any recommendations for changes. In this presentation, in the recommendation section, I've listed the institutions that specifically mention the recommendations, and we invite robust discussion at that time. And I'll try to get through the first 2 parts of this pretty quickly. Next slide, please, Heather. First, most institutions felt that overall the model was working as intended and included the appropriate metrics. We noted at the first meeting of this work group that the model is distributing funding based on performance, and the model provides incentives to achieve important state goals. The state funding is no longer being distributed based on historical share, but on outcomes, and growth rates above the sector average are resulting in an increased share of funding for a given metric. Heather, next slide, please. As we mentioned previously, institutions are reacting to the model strategically, and in both the university and the KCTCS models, institutions are progressing toward funding parity. Next slide, please. In terms of unanticipated consequences, there's a perception that many
Sean,
comprehensives.
Before
Yes,
we
sir.
get into that, let me go back and give some information that I got, and that way people can have this in their brains as we go through some of this, okay? Just to let you know, we're down in enrollment in most places. Our public universities are down about 2.1%. Our privates are up a pretty good amount. Graduate enrollment is up 6.4% our universities, and a lot of that's fueled by the NKU MSN program, so thanks, Ashish. KCTCS, I said, is down about 8.6%, and URM is down less, though. If you look at the degrees, what I wanted to give the audience, and I do believe that the model has a lot to do with this. Total degrees at public universities are up 3.8% over the last year. URM degrees are up 6.8% over the previous year. Since 2015-16, total degrees at public universities are up at 17.5%, while URMs, and this is one of the best in the country in closing gaps, URM degrees are up 34.1%. Overall, 6-year graduation rate is up 0.4 percentage points over the previous year. URM is up 0.3 percentage points over previous year. This we could do a little better on in that area. Since 2015-16, overall 6-year graduation rates up 5.2 percentage points versus 6.8 percentage points for URM. KCTCS, since 15-16, their 3-year graduation rate is up 7.4 percentage points, and the URM's up 7.8 percentage points. And I could keep on going. There's some other really good news. When we look at our North Star, which is our 60 by 30, this is the way that, at least at CPE, we're looking at all of these variables, antecedent variables that lead to that, you know, and some of the areas where we do have to think about, I'll be talking about later on, is in our adult enrollment, which is down 40%. And there's some other things that will have effect on this 60 by 30, but some of the things that we're working on now are actually pushing us toward that. So I just wanted to give you those data as a way for you to think about the conversations we're having from this point forward.
Thanks, President Thompson. As I kind of glossed over, the model includes sizable premiums for STEM plus H, URM, and low-income degrees, and the funding models are providing financial incentives for increased progression and timely completion. Next slide, please, Heather. As I was saying, in terms of unanticipated consequences, there is a perception that comprehensives and smaller institutions are disadvantaged by research sector weighting and a focus on volume. And there's a perception that it's harder for smaller institutions to earn additional funding. Several institutions pointed out that the model's complexity presented some difficulties. For example, it's hard to anticipate the return on investment for an initiative, and it may be difficult to explain the connection between performance and funding because there are so many metrics, for example. One institution noted that complexity reduces the model's ability to drive change just because there are a number of metrics included. Next slide, please. Some institutions noted that some metrics don't take into consideration efficiency. The square footage metric was discussed by several institutions. As you know, it rewards new space, new construction, but not asset preservation or innovative use of space on campus. Square footage metric does not consider the efficient space utilization or the age of facilities or energy efficiency, for example. Likewise, the instruction and student services spending metric, which is one of the operational support metrics, does not take into account operating efficiency. It's simply a snapshot of the spending on instruction and student services at the institution. Finally, the benefit of enrolling non-resident students is limited by 50% earned credit hour weighting, which one institution pointed out ran counter to the non-resident tuition policy, which encouraged greater recruiting and enrollment of non-resident students. Next slide, please, Heather. A couple of institutions felt that the model could hurt in terms of funding advocacy efforts. One institution pointed out that it's hard to use a volume-based model to get more funding when enrollment is declining. It can also be harder to advocate for additional funding for mandated programs, and redistribution of base. Doing that, it can shift focus away from system funding needs. So the whole idea of adequacy. This is definitely a distribution model as opposed to a funding adequacy model. A couple of institutions pointed out that the model discouraged collaboration and increased competition. And the model, one institution said that the model doesn't sufficiently recognize differences in mission. Next slide, please. Finally, there are some financial concerns, and these have been discussed particularly at the first work group meeting. The models were implemented without any new funding. In budget cut years, institutions essentially are cut twice, or some institutions are essentially cut twice. Three universities and 6 community colleges are facing a fiscal cliff in 21-22. When the 2% stop loss sunsets, if it does sunset. And finally, the unfunded KERS cost increases place comprehensives at a competitive disadvantage. Next slide, please. So we finally get to the recommended adjustments, and I've noted the institutions that specifically.
Sean, let me ask you to stop there for a second. Any comments over the last section? Now we're getting into what people are recommending as adjustments. Not everybody's uniform on these, but I just wanted to make sure that you have an opportunity to say anything you want to say before we get to that point.
Aaron, I'd just like to add the KCTCS has got KERS folks as well.
Thank you, Paul.
And President Thompson, I just would like to flash back, which I note did not make the slides for, I think it was page that was discussed as model working as expected on page 11, that as a statewide model, STEM plus H is a great metric. And so K-State did say that. But as it relates to degree production, with the heavy humanities, social professions, education, criminal justice, we do get some H in the nursing, but it's a small N. It's for some institutions, I did see somewhere where it talked about the complexity not driving an ROI. It just wouldn't make sense for the institution to invest or redirect money from areas into science when there are other schools like UK U of L who do much better job in engineering, physics, and chemistry. And so the STEM plus H, I think, is the absolute right statewide model outcome, but that for some campuses, even redirecting institutional programs to achieve the performance outcome may be a zero sum. You know, whatever you gain on the other side, you'll be losing on the other side.
You know, President Brown brings up a point that was discussed several years ago for those of us who were on this original group. And the hope at that time was, obviously, a hope has always been to get new money, but the hope at that time would that everybody would see a conglomerate or a majority of metrics that would give them a competitive edge. I do want to go back a little bit to what Eli said earlier, which is important, and this really works better with new money, no doubt, is that you're competing against yourself also in many cases here, as well as competing against the sector average. So I think Chris brings a point as we think about what metrics should be in the next go around that we should look at. Now, I will tell you, honestly, I'm representing the state in this conversation in many ways, statewide as a whole. And I do have, based on statistical understandings and where I think the hockey puck is going to be hit to in the future, got some ideas that I like to pose as far as metrics go. Many will look like what we have now, by the way, because we still are a long way before we get there. But I would like for us to think about the point that President Brown made as we discuss the future of what this model looks like.
Can I add one more thing, Aaron? And it's particularly interesting for us. My weeks are running together because everything is Zoom. But last week, I believe it was, or either the week before, Kentucky State hosted our final site visit for membership in COPLAC. And that's the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges. And so for a UK or U of L, AAU would be, you know, the aspiring group. For us, it would be COPLAC. And so this issue, it's not not an anomaly. Other small public liberal arts colleges across the nation, St. Mary's in Maryland, SUNY Geneseo in New York, have the same issue around mission and major offerings towards statewide performance objectives. But both, it's not an either or, but it's just a little asterisk on that one.
Thank you. Sean, go ahead if no one else has any questions.
So as we mentioned previously, we are happy to have lots of discussion in this recommendation section. The first recommendation that stood out when reading over all of these summary statements was the idea of sector differentiation. University of Kentucky, University of Louisville were insistent that all universities stay within the same model. 3 institutions noted that separate models would be better for them. So a separate model for the research institutions, comprehensive institutions, and KCTCS. There were also recommendations regarding the model metrics. Northern and Western advocated for all degrees and credentials being rewarded in the model, not just bachelor's degrees. And I think this speaks to a desire to have micro-credentials included, perhaps, and master's degrees and doctoral degrees as well. Does anyone at Northern or Western want to elaborate or discuss?
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the 60-30 goal does not distinguish between different kinds of things. We're talking about post-baccalaureate certificates, credentials, and degrees. And so I think the logic was that all of that could be, should be considered as part of the discussion with everything, that we're considering right now. So
I do want to point out, just because I'm a part of this history here, as well as a couple of you, that was discussed heavily at the time. And one of the issues that popped up was that UK of L, of course, had by far the majority of those during those times, and whether or not that would allow, quote unquote, parity and the undergraduate degree, the baccalaureate degree in this case for universities, gave us the most comparative metric. So that has been raised. That was discussed heavily, as Eli may remember, and so as well as Senator Givens, who was a part of this conversation.
There was a recommendation that the square footage metric be eliminated or modified in some way at University of Louisville, EKU, and Morehead. All specifically mentioned that square footage metric as being problematic and advocating some change or revisiting that metric. The non-resident student weighting, the 50% non-resident student weighting for the earned credit hour portion, Murray, Northern, and Western all indicated a desire to revisit that metric in particular. Eastern and Morehead indicated a desire to change the instruction and student services metric. So as I mentioned, that's one of the operating support metrics.
Sean, this is David. I think that one kind of caveat to that, I think that also speaks to efficiency within the instructional and student services side.
I would also point out that the future of education may be a lot without walls. So as we look at instructional space, I think we have to take that into account when we look at that metric as far as square footage.
Heather, would you go back one slide? A number of the presidents on this call were not part of the, okay, this isn't the slide. I think you went back one too many, Heather. Yes, a number of the presidents on this call were not part of the previous working group. And I just want to give a little bit of background information about that instruction and student services metric. As we were looking at those operational support components and had identified, M&O, institutional support, and academic support as three areas of spending at the public universities. And the level of spending was approximately 10% for each of those components. As we discussed, okay, how are we going to design a metric for that institutional support metric, which is essentially the administrative overhead of the institution. And so what the working group coalesced around, instead of saying, well, let's just look at institutional support spending and do that as a percent of total as the metric, there was a decision made that if we looked at instruction and student services combined spending, that would give a good proxy for the size of a given institution. And the logic was that the larger an institution is, the greater the need they have for administrative overhead of all those various colleges and departments. And we did not want to give an incentive for institutions to keep increasing their spending on institutional support in order to get increased funding through the funding model. So what we wanted to do was to say, let's tie it to instruction and student services, which is a good proxy for size. But now administrators at each university have to think twice when they need to implement budget cuts of whether they want to cut the academic enterprise, which directly is responsible for educating and retaining students, which is the instruction and student services spending. So that was that was the rationale behind that particular metric.
Bill, I think that's good perspective. I think that given the financial environments we find ourselves in, and as we look at the totality of the support for the institutional enterprise, it's hard to not have impact in those spaces when we have pressures that push in from the outside. So I just think this is one of those areas, and while I wasn't a president at the time, I had a chance to participate in the process. I think this is one we can work on a little bit in the coming days. So.
Next slide, please, Heather. Both the University of Louisville and Northern Kentucky University mentioned increasing low-income bachelor's degree and URM bachelor's degree weighting as a possible adjustment to the model. Both institutions also advocated decreasing operational support metrics, the weighting for those in the model as well. So there's some alignment there. This next section.
And Sean, let me jump in just for 1 second and let the folks on this call know that CPE, President Thompson and his executive leadership team, we have a summary statement as well. We didn't want to include it with the materials for today because we wanted to focus on the campus summary statements. But under that heading of funding model metrics, there is consensus among the executive leadership team here at CPE that we might want to consider adding an adult learner metric.
Thanks, Bill. This next section focuses on essentially on the application of the model, how the model is applied, with the exception of that first one, reinvest in post-secondary education. While those institutions specifically called that out, I believe all the institutions are on board that reinvestment in post-secondary education has to happen for any real progress. The next three recommendations make up the core of what was styled the Murray State proposal, which is going to be discussed in the next part of the meeting. So that's on today's agenda. But briefly, a 0% stop loss in 21-22, the need for a permanent stop loss going forward, and preserving hold harmless amounts in an institution's base, so not making that funding subject to redistribution beginning in 21-22. So that'll be discussed in the next part of the agenda. Heather, next slide, please. And finally, the summary statements included some recommendations that we saw coming from only one institution. University of Kentucky advocated for eliminating the degree efficiency metric. That's the normalization of bachelor's degrees using the degrees per 100 FTE index. So that certainly adds some complexity. I believe the folks at UK mentioned that increases in enrollment can hurt with that metric because it looks like you're being less efficient, but in reality, you're bringing in more students. Did I represent that pretty well, Dr. Capilouto?
Yes, sir. I was on mute.
Okay.
It is the case.
The folks at EKU said that there should not be a small school adjustment for University of Kentucky, University of Louisville. They didn't believe research sector weighting was appropriate for FTE. At KSU, they wanted a redesign of the model to include some common and some institution-specific metrics. And I believe Dr. Brown just talked about some of the rationale for that approach. Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Brown?
And more specifically, again, as I continue to try to say, I do believe that all of the metrics are important for the Commonwealth. And so there are sort of two models, one in Florida where there are 10 metrics, for example, all schools do 5, and then all schools get to pick 3 that are specific, free from the other 5. And then there's some models which are sort of similar to what I think Senator Givens' intention was with the hold harmless in the past, where all schools start with 5, and then each year, even though they run the model on the other 5, each year they add 1 additional, which gives time for all the campuses to hopefully be in compliance. So, but I think you captured it correctly on the slide.
At Morehead State University, folks there said that the model should include a poverty adjustment, which would be essentially similar to a small school adjustment. Dr. Morgan, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, Sean, I think we mentioned this also at our last meeting, that some institutions in Kentucky, and Morehead State being maybe a prime example, have very limited ability for tuition elasticity. So with decreases in state appropriation, we have very little, if any, ability to make it up on the tuition side. So some type of adjustment to look at maybe the number of low-income students or students from very distressed economic counties would be appreciated as we look forward.
And I'll just remind everybody that at our last working group meeting, KCTCS put a recommendation on the table for their model that is doing something very similar to this, where they're looking at employment participation, income levels in certain regions, and it's the same thing, President Morgan. Service regions that are associated with certain community colleges are economically depressed, and so they want to make an adjustment in there, what they term is the equity adjustment, which is very similar to the small school adjustment in the public university model. They want to have a larger equity adjustment for institutions that are located in those economically depressed regions.
Next slide, please, Heather. Murray State University's summary statement included 3 recommendations that we didn't see elsewhere. Eliminate earned credit hour weighting by level and discipline and non-resident student differential. And so that would take away the weighting by level and discipline in the earned credit hour portion, the 35% of the model that goes toward earned credit hour, and it would take away the 50% differential. So that would just be a 1 multiplier for all students, regardless of residency. They proposed to take away the difference in the research sector weighting for low income and URM degrees. And they also propose using the percent of formula share to distribute funds, as opposed to what we have been using, which is calculating the using the hold harmless and that approach. Dr. Jackson, would you care to elaborate on any of these recommendations?
Sean, thanks. You summarized it extremely well. The credit hour weighting and the non-resident weighting really goes counter to what we've agreed to, as was pointed out earlier, for the non-resident agreements, I think, that we've put in place for, I think, every institution for the most part this past year, is why we mentioned that. The low income and URM component has been mentioned by others. As a reminder, for the comprehensives, the URM and low income weighting is 1.0. For the research institutions, it's 2.35 and 1.22 respectively. So I think there's some improvements there that we could make, that we would appreciate, that would balance out those components much better. and it actually addresses some of Dr. Morgan's concerns from a poverty standpoint also. We're all dealing with more low income, and we all are dealing with more URM degree production, students and degree production. The percent share is part of the model. As you know, that's the last step before the final step of the calculation of the model. We just think that should be looked at more closely too. We've talked to Bill about that at length and Dr. Thompson over the last many months. So, but thank you.
And we had a request from Jackie Dudley, President Jackson, to try to include some slides that would show what we're talking about with that particular recommendation. But I want to say it was just yesterday morning when she asked if we could include that. It might have been the afternoon before, but we just did not have time to work up some slides and include it in today's presentation. But we will be bringing some tables that show the impact, some scenarios that show the impact of that approach at the next meeting.
And at the folks at Northern presented 3 recommendations that weren't included elsewhere in this presentation. Add a first generation metric, add a KCTCS transfer metric to the university model, and to encourage transfers to come to the institution, and finally to review mandated programs and small school adjustment. Dr. Padilla, any elaboration you'd like to make to these recommendations?
No, I think that hopefully it provides an explanation. I mean, I'm always cautious about adding any more metrics than we have, and I think a thorough review of everything would be helpful. But you know, a big component for all our institutions is to serve first generation students and build in social and economic mobility, and so that's an important element that I think we want to capture. The KCTCS one, I believe, is another important one to consider, and this talks about some of the collaboration that I feel is missing in the original model. You know, our KCTCS colleges do an outstanding job, but I think part of it would be to help also both incentivize completion, but also incentivize transfer from an associate's to a 4-year baccalaureate, and I think that adds some value as well. And the current model does really not do that. And as far as the mandated programs and small school adjustment, I think the question is simply to say this is one of those ideas where, you know, if you take certain things off the top, then there's less discretionary available anyway. So I think just a complete look at what those programs are and why they're essential, along with the small school adjustment, which I think just needs a little bit more clarity before we head further down. So those would be my additional points.
Ashish, in full disclosure to everybody on here, you know, once again, I look at the 60 by 30. I don't apologize for that, but we're going to have to do better in our transfers. We have to do better in our adult learners. We just have to get where we need to go. Those are 2 areas, and we do have a fairly decent seamless transfer system, but we've got to figure out how to do that. We also have to do better, which we have some control over, in getting more high school seniors to go to college, not go in the other direction. So I'm working with Jason Glass and the governor's office, Lieutenant Governor in this case, being in workforce and education, to try to figure out how to create a seamless conversation. Representative Tipton and I have had some long discussions about this for a while, but we're going to have all of those to truly get where we need to go. Now, whether we include them in our performance funding or not, it'll be left up to this group, but I think we have to consider those sorts of items in order to get where we need to go.
Aaron, excuse me, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I encourage everyone to read all of the summary statements. They're in your materials, and if you find anything that needs to be changed, or if you'd like for me to add something or your institution's endorsement to a recommendation, please let me know.
I'm going to pose a question and set a context too. There are numerous suggestions here that I would imagine, my recollection, I think I'm the only president that went through the first phase of this, first iteration, that would require a major rewrite of the legislation because it gets into some things that are in statute. I'd further contextualize it this way, going back to the slide that Bill showed in terms of the dollar change per student over this time period. The University of Kentucky, I will tell you that we use the main metrics in this model to signal to our faculty and staff what matters. Those are low income, underrepresented minorities, STEM degrees. The more intricate the model gets is going to be lost on people. It's those signals that matter. But even with the successes that are pointed out in our enrollment, our dollar change went up $59 a student. One university went down. Two universities went down. 4 universities went up, ranging anywhere from $410 to $620 per student. I think the question we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to be tinkering with this, is what kind of difference is it really going to make? And especially as it pertains to the intricacies of rewriting legislation.
Could I dovetail on that, please, with what President Capilouto said? I do think when you're thinking about large public policy moves, the purpose of them is signaling the marketplace and allowing the market to shift to that model. And we all can quibble about small adjustments to what is a very complex, well thought out design model that people who preceded us, other than Eli and some other folks on the call, invested a significant amount of time in. And 3 years of operation is really not enough time for these huge behemoths of organizations to adjust to what those signals are. And so, as much as I appreciate the breadth of the conversation and the detail with which we're having it, I also think there is some value in thinking about how do you allow for a public policy decision to really shape organizational decisions. Our strategic plan aligns with the performance funding model, but that's a 10-year plan. And so we all have critiques. Some of them are smaller than others, but I would be cautious, and myself and caution the whole group to not tinker too soon.
First of all, I don't disagree with either of those statements. I think it's important that we do look at what has been working and how it has changed the strategic agenda in my shop, as well as your strategic plan in your shop. For an example, it's clear that the degree metric is working. I mean, the credential metric is working well. It's clear that the URM is working extremely well. And this makes me happy because we have to do that. So the conversation, the low income hasn't worked as well as we need it for it to. So it's not just talking about metrics and other metrics, it's talking about how can we make some of those that we know we still have to have work better, in my opinion, whether or not it has the right weightings, as an example. So I think you're right. I think as much as talking about adding new stuff or taking away old stuff is how do we make those items that now are a part of our agenda or its strategic plans to work over a long period of time. And as someone who's a statistician, I can tell you 3 years normally gives you some trend, but it doesn't give you a lot of trends. It doesn't give you a lot of info, right? It can help you to identify holes. It can help you to figure out exactly how you plug those holes with what's working versus what's not working. But I hear you, and Tim and Eli, I do agree with those sentiments.
Okay, if there are no further questions or comments, are we ready to move to the next section, President Thompson?
We are. I think we're doing pretty good on time, Bill. I just want to make sure everybody has a chance for us to walk out with a couple of things. So I want you to go to the next section.
As President Thompson said earlier, and he's absolutely correct, even though the title of this slide says Review Murray State University Proposal, this was a proposal that was submitted to CPE by President Bob Jackson on behalf of several presidents that had contacted him with suggestions in order that we could bring those before the working group today. So this, like President Thompson said, is not specifically a Murray State proposal. But in terms of the components of what are in the proposal, these next two slides provide the essence of what was proposed. And there was a paragraph lead in that basically talked about, given the uncertainties, revenue lost, and increased expenses related to the COVID-19 pandemic, unknown status of the any additional federal funding, and the potential for a significant mid-year budget cut. As we all know, State Budget Director Hicks sent a letter out 4 or 5 weeks ago asking for state agencies and the post-secondary institutions to come up with some preliminary planning estimates for how they would take an 8% budget cut. And then lastly, it's still unclear what's going to happen in terms of the pension as the General Assembly comes back into the session in January. So given that context, these are the proposals that were made by several campus presidents that President Jackson put down on paper and shared with the group. The first component is to continue to run the funding model for next year as defined in statute, with any modifications identified by the working group and that might be approved by the General Assembly. And we really want to have some discussion at this stage in the meeting. So I'm going to open it up to the presidents on this call and any other working group members, elected officials, state budget director. Is there anyone that has any issues or comments regarding component number one, that we should continue to run the model with any modifications that might be approved by the General Assembly and by this group? Okay, hearing.
I'm going to ask differently because I guess we have to move forward. And my guess is Budget Director Hicks may have something to say, but what I'd like to do is to get some of the things that we can do and put that in the water bucket, I guess, because we have to have some stuff to present here in December. This was number one, I think most all the presidents that interacted with this agreed with that. So Budget Director Hicks, I see you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks. I'm having trouble considering number one without considering number two. Bill, if you could give us, because I see those two things clearly working together, so that would be helpful.
By the way, of the presidents that responded to this, 100% agreed with both one and two, to put it in perspective, if that saves. Not every president responded, though, but most did.
Yes, State Budget Director Hicks, the way I interpret this, and of course, this was something that was sent to us by the presidents, but my interpretation of this is we obviously want to be productive in this working group. If there are any suggested modifications to the model that there's consensus around, we want to include that in our report recommendations, and we want to take that to the General Assembly and give them an opportunity to take action or not on those particular recommendations. You can run the model in 2021-22, even if there is no new funding. And you can add a third year to the rolling 3-year average of data. You can continue to track the trends, and the model is still in place. But if there's no dollars in that post-secondary education performance fund, either through an additional appropriation on the part of the General Assembly or through a 1 or 2% loss contribution, for example. If there's no dollars in the fund, there's nothing to distribute, but you can still run the model and as I say, track those trends in the data. And I think there might have been some sense, and this may be overly optimistic or hopeful, that Congress might reach some kind of a resolution and provide, state and local governments funding to help offset their revenue losses as a result of the pandemic. And should there be any new funding,
Just a moment, please.
that's provided by the General Assembly, that would obviously be run through the performance funding model. But since you say it's tied to number 2, let's go ahead and talk about number 2. And I think this is important because most of these proposals, in my mind, are more in the camp of how do you apply the model differently versus changes in the actual performance funding model. So what number 2 is suggesting is that you apply the model next year so that no institution incurs a financial loss or gain of general fund as a result of running the model. In other words, the proposal is to implement a 0% stop loss. And we all have seen the impact of, the 3-year phase in with a 1 and a 2% stop loss contribution in the most recent 2 years. But it was implemented with a 6.25% budget cut and then a 1% mid-year budget cut. And that's impacted a couple of institutions, KSU and Morehead specifically, and some of our KCTCS institutions as well. It's impacted them to a greater degree on the negative side. And so I think the sense is for most of the presidents that if there's not going to be some new funding put into the performance funding model, if we put that 0% stop loss in place, at least you're not continuing to redistribute the base. As one of the board members, I believe it was at Murray, said in an article I read, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And when you rob Peter to pay Paul, you don't ever get an argument from Paul. So at any rate, I think that's what's going on. I question in number 2, the 2 words that say or gain, because what I think the presidents are really trying to get to is that there's no loss in terms of redistributing the base to any institution. But if there did happen to be, pennies from heaven and additional appropriation available, I would think that we would want to say, let's distribute that using the model and allow some of our institutions to gain from any additional funding that might be forthcoming.
Thanks, Bill.
That's a long explanation. I hope I answered your question.
You did. And if you don't mind, I've got one further question on number 1, because I see 2 things in that element. One is continue to run the model, if you've explained. The other was to apply any adjustments this group may propose possibly to the fiscal 22 running of the model. And I see those as 2 different things. And I hearken back to President Caboni's comment about being sensitive to change and the ability to react to change. And so the original intent would have been that this working group would have made recommendations. And if the General Assembly were to adopt some of those, it would not have applied to the fiscal year 22 running of the model in the first place. It's only because we have this, this deadline and the 1-year budget. So I just wanted to say, I look at those 2 things, that one item as 2 recommendations.
Although they are very close, I think, John, your point is well taken, because it could actually have an effect on that if we do change the model. So yes. So that has to be a caveat we think about if we adopt this.
But Aaron, make sure I understand this. I mean, in reality, if you apply number 2 here, you're not running the model. I mean, everything's frozen.
Well,
unless there were new funding, which
unless
is
there's
highly
new funding.
unlikely. Yeah.
Okay, and then what are you going to do? You're gonna then run the model? I mean, that's why I said it's a little premature to make this decision. I'm not talking about significant amount of money, it looks like right now, if any.
Other comments?
So let me ask Eli for further clarification. Are you saying it's too early to make a decision as of right now before we end in December, or is it too early to make the decision until we figure out if we get money?
No, I was thinking you were asking for a decision today, Aaron.
Oh, okay.
And that's
what I am asking for is if there's things that we all can agree on, we'll put it in the bucket. If there's not, we'll keep it on the table. So no, I'm not forcing, I couldn't force anyway, but I'm not asking that we force a decision. I'm saying is that if there's things that we all say, yeah, we agree on that, we'll just put that behind and go on to something else. But I don't know how we answer that fully without fully knowing if we got money. And maybe I'm missing some interpretation of this, which I'm happy to be corrected by anybody, by the way.
So Aaron, this is Ashish. I want to just jump in and I want us not to lose sight of the opening paragraph that lays some of these other points that I know are just for discussion today. Let's not really forget what all of us are going through at this very moment in time. The three crises we're talking about: the pandemic, the economic recession, and of course the social crisis. We clearly have all our plates are incredibly full. And I'm speaking certainly on behalf of myself here, but I can only imagine my colleagues going through the same thing. Our staff, our people, I'm sure your staff and people are heavily taxed. The emotional burden of what's happening is tremendous. So what my concern right now is how much both emotional, mental, and physical energy can we expend between now and December to come up with a revised plan? Because I do believe in continuous improvement. I think there's a lot of consensus around what the model is supposed to do and how it's supposed to function and what the metrics are. And I agree, tinkering may not be the best thing, but continuous improvement is never a bad idea. The question simply is, with all the issues we have to do, we're certainly not out of the woods yet. I know our state budget director is with us on the call, as are our legislative leaders. And I want to be mindful and respectful of the situation, but what is the likelihood of new or additional funding, given the realities of what not only we as a state are facing, but as a nation are facing? And so given all that, I think the idea was that this requires good, significant strategic thinking. We've made some really good progress up to this point. How can we continue to both run the model, live up to the statute that is required, not create additional financial burden for institutions, and then really reconvene in the summer? So essentially the points 1 and 2 would be to ensure that is kind of what the idea is, and then really reconvene in the summer to have the same timeline by which we would extend a model beyond. So I just want to reemphasize that point again, just from my point of view. That the first paragraph that lays the foundation is something that we shouldn't forget.
I'd be interested for any of the elected members of the General Assembly to speak up now if they'd like, or Budget Director Hicks. I'd be happy to hear what you have to say in addition.
Aaron, this is Senator Givens. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So first I want to go back to, maybe it was slide 10 or 11 in the presentation, as we talked about the model functioning as expected. And I think it's important in the context of the word tweaks, because a couple of folks have used the word tweaks, and I think anything we do is going to have to be that. As we talk about potential changes to the model, we've got a model indicated by slides 10 and 11 that's working very effectively. I realize the word most is there at the start, not all institutions. I'm confident there are some that did not support or did not mention these items. But when we have most of the institutions responding to such a well thought out model, that the model is working as expected, the model's using the appropriate metrics, student success is enhancing the focus on state goals. Aaron, you used the phrase North Star. This has truly been that for so many of these institutions, as we've seen in this move toward 60 by 30. So I think as I speak to the question that you've laid out for where I stand, I'm going to be very, very strong in my emphasis that anything we do be a slight change. If we've got a North Star and the compass is pointing us in the right direction, we don't need, in my opinion, to try and move the North Star. If we do, we move it very, 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 very slightly. Specific to the 1 and 2, and if you can go back to the slide we're working on now, my concern is more of a precedential nature than it is specific to the immediate. So rephrasing that, my concern is more to the longer term than it is the shorter term. I have seen in my tenure in the General Assembly, if we step away from something, we set a precedent for having stepped away. So I am going to be very, very, I don't want to say dug in, but I'm going to be very hard to move for us to not run the model. So I'm rather emphatic in I want us to run the model, certainly with any modifications that we agree to and that can be adopted by the General Assembly. So I'd like to see the model run, and I say that very clearly. Specific to the question of new money or no new money, you heard me say in our first meeting, my greatest regret as a 12-year legislator is that we haven't funded post-secondary education at the same time that we've implemented this model. That's truly and sincerely been my greatest regret. I can make all kinds of excuses. You know all the excuses. It is what it is. We need that new funding. Whether it's the 9.2 million that just basically gets replaced the loss over the period of time that was in one of Bill's slides. My conscience would feel better. I don't know that anybody's pocketbooks would feel better, but my conscience would feel better, if nothing else. I can't speak to the new money question. That's still going to be determined depending largely on what Consensus Forecast Group gives us, depending on what the federal government does, depending on so many other variables. So I think you're hearing me say, I want us to do number one. I'm a little cautious about saying yes to number two, a 0% stop loss. that effectively says we're just going back to a shares model in some ways, because what you got last time is going to be what you get this time, regardless of your performance. Now, NKU President made a wonderful statement about the uncertainty of these times. And that's real. That's real. I can only imagine, and I applaud each of you for the work you're doing. When President Thompson can put up the information that in the midst of state budget declining state budget support, you're moving the ball down the field, and not just in small yardage gains, but in sizable chunks of landscape in moving toward this 60 by 30. I'm so appreciative of what all of you are doing, because it impacts all of us across the state. I'm a little hesitant again to say 0% stop loss, but that's where I am. Thank you, Aaron.
I want to give Representative Tipton an opportunity and Budget Director Hicks an opportunity too. I do want to say I would be remiss if I didn't say this, and I know Senator Givens and Representative Tipton are so tired of hearing me say this. You know, we have stepped up to the plate in higher education, and we know the pull that you guys have, no doubt. My argument is that strategically thinking about the economy and the workforce, finding some money strategically, and I understand there's demands, I understand the balanced budget, strategically to help us to keep moving toward a strong economy with a strong workforce. And higher education, I can show you statistically, is that magic element to make that happen. I would hope that that would be some of your discussions. And Senator Givens, I so appreciate your last statement. It's one of your biggest regrets. I just remember us talking about this a long time ago when you were having this initial conversation with us, and you said that would be your goal to make that happen once we got this implemented. And I know that's in fact the truth. So I appreciate the statement, and I hope that we're able to have some strategic conversation as we go into this one-year budget to see what we can do in order to at least help our universities and colleges continue to make this movement.
Aaron, listening to Senator Givens, I mean, one thing I think about is for number two to consider in the future is some sort of minimal stop loss, something. You know, it's 1%, for instance.
And I'm going to jump in with respect, Representative Tipton and State Budget Director Hicks, and just remind everybody on this call that according to the statute as currently written in 2021-22, there would be no stop loss. And that represents potentially a major change for Kentucky State University, potentially losing, $6.8 million out of their funding to educate students, which would be about 30% of their base. Morehead State University, 2.8 million, around 7 or 8% of their state funds to educate students. And so that's certainly a consideration in terms of what the current statute says. And then I'll remind everybody that Scott Belcher 2 meetings ago talked about, how do you apply a model in an environment like the one we're currently in. And he gave the example of a state that had a model which had no stop loss. And he actually said some states might want to consider re-implementing a stop loss to limit the potential redistribution of funds in this type of environment. So I just wanted to provide you with that context.
Well, I think Eli made a statement we jumped over fairly quickly. Senator Givens, were you going to say something?
Aaron, if I could briefly, I want to follow Bill's statement with a quick yes, but sort of thing. Bill, you rightly mentioned the 2% sunset. That was purposeful. If you recall, we went into the statute in the spring and wrote that in to prevent the sort of cliff that we're talking about, knowing that this work group was going to be meeting this summer for the purpose of deciding and discussing what a going forward stop loss, if there was one, should be. And so the sunset occurs, but we set the time of the sunset not so very long ago, knowing that we'd be here today setting a new time for the sunset.
Yes, absolutely correct. Yes.
Representative Tipton, you were going to say something, sir. You're on mute.
There we are. Can you hear me now?
Can indeed.
I apologize. I'm a little technology just get by, but it's good to see everybody here today. And I want to just reemphasize some of the statements that have been made to all the university presidents and their staff. Your work and your staff's work is very much appreciated. I've got a daughter who's a senior, and she was desperate to get back to school in person and finish that senior year. And I know you all put a lot of work in all your campuses for our students across the state. And it's very, getting back to our subject, it's very difficult to make decisions without all the data. Senator Givens mentioned until the consensus forecast group meets in December and gives us those projections, we really won't know where we are. I would say that if COVID had not struck us in March and our budget had kind of gone on as it went through the House and the Senate, I think the money that was going to be added to post-secondary, I think the tone of this conversation would be completely different. And I think we see a lot more optimism, but unfortunately that did not happen. We are where we are, and we have to move forward. The likelihood of new money, I think you all understand it's going to be very, very difficult to happen because the state's going to have a lot of other increased costs that we're having to deal with. The pensions, I think, is a subject that we have to continue to address. Our regionals or comprehensives are really hit with this huge KERS pension obligation, and it's putting them in a big burden. The main thing, it's very difficult for us to make decisions today. As President Vadea said, we need more information, and it may be more prudent to get out of this pandemic, give us some time to see how the economy rebounds. We still just don't know how quickly the economy will rebound. So there's a lot of unknowns right now. So, but I think these are some good points that are being made for conversation. I look forward to continuing that. It may be maybe Director Hicks will have some good news for us for September numbers. We'll see here in a few days. But we've got too many unknowns right now to really make any definite decisions. So again, appreciate the opportunity to participate and a lot of good points being made today.
Dr. Thompson, this is John Hicks. I want to just add first. I want to say that we do have the short run and the long term, and I want to give high compliments to the authors of the legislation, because it is not often that we see sunsetting in state government programs, and I thought that was a very wise addition to the legislation when it was passed. Because it created this kind of opportunity for this group of people to consider, what has the past shown us, and how might we strategically look forward in the future. So that's a big compliment that we're engaging in this kind of process now. That is often not done in so many public policy areas. So, I just like Representative Tipton said, we've got a whole lot in front of us that we need to have answered before we can consider, funding issues. And so I'll continue to keep my eye on the longer term strategic purposes, of this group and of the legislation. You've presented a lot of information today that, I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to fully vet through, and look forward to perhaps, digging in a little bit further. But the other thing that's going to be, that's possible, whether it happens in the short run or whether it happens a few months from now, is there may be new federal dollars, that come in, that have as a purpose to help state governments, to deal with the recession. And, just as a reminder, be thinking about, what if the feds provide additional funding and do not dictate its allocation methodology as they did with some of the prior funding? And some of it could be used possibly as a replacement for state funding. So that's a small short-term issue that I want to put on everybody's plate to think about, is how would we adjust in the budgeting process, the replacement of state dollars with federal dollars in the very short run. But again, I appreciate being a part of the group, and wished I had. I wish I knew Representative Tipton. We're going to release September, but September is just September, and there are a lot of things coming as we are looking forward to. we've been watching states as they're trying to project revenues for fiscal 22, and they're really having a big problem with fiscal 21 projections. So time will tell. But again, I think, Aaron, I think your comments about keeping our eye on the ball for the 60-30, I take that into to heart, but want to understand some of the more strategic changes that some of the campuses are recommending.
Aaron?
Thank you, John. Neely, were you wanting to say something?
Yes, sir. When we think about models, you've all heard me say that I think this is a great performance funding model because it focuses on outcomes and where we are going. I still believe that. I also completely agree that for a model to be effective, where we can drive change, the simpler, the better. Of course, it's not going to capture all of the nuances. So two things that I wanted to say as we think about this, and it's really looking at the future and looking at where education is going. Maybe that space criterion that we have truly deserves us to take a look at it, because space is not just space, even instructional space. We do know that nursing simulation labs will cost us a whole lot more than a seminar room, et cetera. I just think that, and that's happening in business as well, as you know, moving away from space-based. So that's one thing we might want to think about. And I don't know how this impacts, but I think particularly about Moorhead and Murray and K-State and lots of the institutions. If we took those dollars and allocated it to low income, you know, the URM and low income, is that going to actually drive more focus on outcomes? It's just an idea. And I do agree that overall, I would never be in favor of, let's just go back to wherever we were. It is this true, unprecedented, it feels like. Of course, I've been president for 2 years and 3 months, of which 6 months have been COVID. So I shouldn't make those grandiose statements. But right now, this moment feels very, very challenging and unique in talking to people. So whatever we can do, thinking about the whole state and preserving the higher ed system is what I think we're all trying to do in terms of the stop loss as well.
It's really good to hear. I'm trying to think of the right descriptor. But this performance funding model, as someone who's been in higher education in Kentucky now for over 30 years, and I know I don't look that old, this to me is a model that's going to drive, it's really connecting what higher education has been honestly much about, not total. I mean, education by itself is good. I'm not talking about it's good for civic engagement. It's good for health. It's good for ability to make good friends and have great communication. So I know it's good and all that. So what I'm about to say, someone's going to say, Aaron, but it's good unto itself. It is. But it's truly good in driving this economy. It's really good in getting us fifth from the bottom in poverty. It's really good to do a lot of other things. So this model is really working in that regard. There are some things that are not working as well as they should in that regard. So I appreciate the conversation we're having along those lines. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to, Bill, once you move on and get us through the rest of this. Yes.
I want to clarify add one quick point to item 2, because in my role, and everyone that has called me, and I think it was unanimous, the real intent, please think of it this way, everyone's intentions and plans and recommendations are good to strengthen our system, our entire higher ed system in this Commonwealth. Number one, there's great uncertainty, which causes great concern and fear for all of us in that regard. But the real impetus behind 2 was in the event there's no new money, which is very possible, right? In the event there's no new money, we would stop trading each other's money. And that was really the intent of 2, I think. And we use the analogy of taking from Peter to pay Paul, a good biblical reference in regard to that. But I think that was the real point. Not more than that or not less than that, is no new money. We don't simply trade each other's, if you will.
Bob, I think we probably agreed to this as well. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that if you look at the inequity in FTE funding, I appreciate using performance to be able to do that. But there's a $700 gap per FTE between Murray State and WKU to the advantage of Murray. There's a $1,200 gap between Northern and Murray. And I don't know if that's the way in which we should be allocating resources. And if there's not going to be new money, how does the model help shift that gap? Because that's not equitable. And I appreciate in this year not doing that. But I think that we have to put it, if we think about eliminating the stop loss completely in perpetuity, well, and there's no new money, that removes all incentive to move toward that North Star. So I appreciate in this year, I appreciate not wanting to harm any institution. At the same time, Northern and Western they're not equitably funded. And I know the model has moved us there in some ways, but I would be remiss if I didn't make that argument on behalf of WKU.
And I'm not here to debate that. I'm referencing numerous comments that have come to me and Dr. Thompson and others in regard to this. I think that we have to look at total public funds in regard to all of this, number one, and that your tuition rate is much higher than Morehead's or Murray's or Kentucky State's, as an example. That should be looked at. And then the financial ramifications of three institutions, two more than the third, which is Morehead, Murray, and Kentucky State, are quite large, millions. It could put two or three institutions at risk. And I don't think that's the intent of anyone either. So I would close with that. I think that was the intent of number two. It was simply that, and everyone's intentions are good and pure in regard to it. It's to protect and enhance our system.
And I won't jump in the middle of that other than to say this. What Bob is saying is right. We've gotten numerous calls on that one item from a lot of people, not just from this group, believe me. I've been inundated from folk in the legislature, folks out there, other people that talk about certain institutions losing money to others and so on. Now, whether that created a conversation here that we need to have and deal with, that's another point. But that part is true. The other point I will say, as we look at those that are on the cliff, I would be cautious for us to think about, especially our community and technical colleges, cautious for us to look at those are in some of the areas that education is needed the most. And so how do we serve those folks as well as we should? Morehead, you would argue the same point. I'm sure Murray, KSU, and others. But the idea that we should be developing a strong educational system, does that mean, I won't get into the conversation where we need all of our institutions or not, but my goal is to work hard to make sure that whatever educational institutions we have, that they're strong in serving the needs of the state. And Senator Gibbons, I know you wanted to say something. I saw you came unmuted there.
So President Thompson, I'll be brief, but you had asked for a couple of things to put in the bucket, and listening to President Jackson and his very appropriate statements, and then listening to President Caboni and his certainly appropriate statements. If you want something from Senator Gibbons to put in the bucket, I'll give you something that you can put in, and this is one of those, well, it doesn't matter, but it does in some ways. I can share with you with a very definite note of strength in my voice that a 0% stop loss into perpetuity is not something I would support. And in addition, a total cliff into perpetuity with no stop loss forevermore is also something I would not support. So if that helps any, there's a couple of goalposts. Now they're really, really far apart, but we've got two end zones in my mind, both extremes laid out. And somewhere we're going to fall between those two, I sense, but it's always good to be able to know that you've got markers out there. I don't think in my envisioning of the formula originally that it was going to be, and we've said it multiple times, I never thought that we would be taking money from institutions to give to other institutions as the formula has done. And so I'm thankful we've kept the stop loss going forward. Now, at some point in time, there is going to be new money. There's no doubt at some point in the future, in my mind, there's going to be new money, and that will certainly change the tone, as Representative Tipton said. But again, I've got those two goalposts to offer. If you need something to put in the bucket so that when you go home today, your bucket is not empty.
Well, I appreciate that, as a matter of fact. And we're going to have to get through the rest of this in 5 minutes. I will tell you, Eli said something earlier we just kind of skipped over. Eli, what I thought I heard you say is that you would be in favor of a 1% stop loss. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, Aaron. I have no idea what the consequences. This is for our institution. Nobody can know. Nobody's run models and all, but it seemed like, a recognition of what people, I think, have said, at least some compromise on it. I don't think it would be, that disruptive. And indeed, if institutions have made gains, some slight recognition of that would certainly, be meaningful. So that was my perspective.
Well, thank you. Folks, I don't mean to rush us up, but we have another meeting coming up at 11 where we have Dr. Stack talking with the presidents a little bit about what's up with us. But Bill, run through the other, but please understand we have 5 minutes, okay?
Okay. Number 3 on the current slide is really just a continuation of number 2. In fact, in the original proposal, it was part of the same paragraph. And so that has to do essentially with in 2021-22, no formula gains or deficits will accumulate or accrue. Heather, go to the next slide. I'm not exactly sure what number 4 is all about, and President Jackson, maybe you can explain. Existing appropriations should be maintained at the 2021 level for each institution unless new funds are awarded, either to the performance fund or the base of each university. What specifically are you driving at with that proposal?
Well, I think the intent from others, as well as Murray State, several, is again this loss of funds unless there's a mandated cut, that we're not trading each other's money again from that standpoint, and we protect those that are nearing the fiscal cliff as we approach June 30th. So it was maybe it's an additional way to say exactly that.
Okay, thank you for that. Component number 5, implement a perpetual 2% stop loss beginning in 2022-23 so that no institution loses more than 2% of its formula base in any 1 year due to running the model. So that is a proposal for a perpetual 2% stop loss. And of course, a decision has to be made by this group about what to do in 2021-22, but this is a proposal for 2023 and beyond. So I'll let folks give us some input about component number 5.
Well, Bill, we may not have a lot of time to get input today. We got about 3 minutes. What I'm going to suggest that we do, since we're almost out of time, is for us to look at this. We can come back. I would like to have a lot of, if y'all would send Bill or me input on these items. I think it's important for us to really talk about it the next time out, even in greater detail, especially number 6, which to me is a way of thinking about getting to some level of parity quicker by holding the hold harmless folk, putting that money to the end, to their base. So I would ask you to think about that for us to have another conversation too for the next time.
President Thompson, yeah, so quickly, Heather, go to the next slide. I'll just tell folks what these slides are and we can continue the discussion next time. This is comparing the actual 2021 calculations for the current year in columns A and B, both the performance distribution and those hold harmless allocations. You can see highlighted in yellow the hold harmless amounts for K-State, Moorhead and Murray, 2.8 million. For Moorhead, 6.8 million for K-State, and 675,000 for Murray. And it's comparing it to a hypothetical, which is what is being proposed by President Jackson and the other presidents, which is to eliminate that fiscal cliff by adding those dollars, or at least treating those dollars at K-State, Moorhead, and Murray, similar to the way we treat the small school adjustment, which means it would be backed out and retained in the base of those institutions before you run the allocable resources through the funding model. And what I wanted to show with this slide is that in the current year, it would not have changed the performance distribution at all, other than a few rounding errors. Each institution would receive the same performance distribution. The only difference is the fiscal cliff is eliminated for KSU, Moorhead, and Murray. Quickly, Heather, go to the next slide. This shows what would happen hypothetically next year. If the performance funding dollars earned in the current year were added to the base to start the 2021-22 fiscal year. If there were no changes, that's shown on the left side of this slide, the current model with no changes, columns A and B, you can see the resulting distribution. And there are the hold harmless allocations in column B. K-State still down 6.5, Moorhead still down 2 million. But if we ran the modified small school adjustment approach, you can see the difference in the performance distribution in column C, and there is no fiscal cliff in column D. Now, I know all of you are looking at—
Bill, I'm going to have to cut you off, my friend, because we have to get on the next call. Unless the presidents want to sign off, I need to get off and go and welcome our guest in for the presidents come on. Do you all want Bill to continue as I go and jump in on the next call?
5 minutes.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump off. Bob Jackson, take care of business. I'll see you all later. Thank you all for being here, folks. And I'll talk with you soon. And we'll send some more information out to you before our next meeting.
Bill, I've got you on a timer.
Yeah, 5 minutes. So as you can see in column E, the difference between the modified small school adjustment approach and the current model with no changes for next year. And of course, there's a lot of assumptions here. We're assuming flat funding, 2% stop loss contribution, no change in performance metric data. But you can see that KSU, Moorhead, and Murray actually have the opportunity to earn additional funding using this distribution, and some of the other institutions are giving up some of the funding that they would have earned if there had been no changes in the model. But go to the next slide, Heather. But it's important to show you, if you compare the stop loss contribution, that hypothetical 2% stop loss contribution that we're talking about for next year, again with flat funding and no change in performance, and you compare that to the modified small school adjustment approach distribution, you can see in column C that there's virtually no difference other than rounding errors. And so every institution would have the opportunity to earn back their 2% stop loss contribution if proposal number 6 were adopted or approved by the post-secondary education working group members. Now, granted, the assumption of no changes in performance is not a valid assumption. But I think what this would do for Kentucky State University and Moorhead and to a lesser extent, but Murray State as well, it would eliminate that fiscal cliff and get them up to the starting line, the same starting line as all of the other universities, and give them the potential through performance to earn some of their stop loss contribution back. And it does so without throwing any of the other institutions out of disequilibrium with one another. And this is an approach that's very similar to the one that KCTCS has recommended for their model to make a change in their equity adjustment, but they're tying it to economic depressed conditions in certain regions. Next slide, Heather. So I just wanted to get through that quickly so everybody understands the impact, the potential fiscal impact of that component number 6 in the Murray State University proposal. And I'm going to take President Thompson at his word and say we don't have time to discuss that today, but we will circle back around and pick that up at our next meeting. In terms of next steps, we're going to share some additional financial impact information at the next meeting. We'll add the total public funds per FTE slide that President Jackson requested. We'll also add a slide that weights the FTE at a 50% weighting for out-of-state students. But what we hope to get accomplished at our next work group meeting is to really roll up our sleeves and start to have some serious discussions about some of these major decision points, front and center sector differentiation, one university model or two, non-resident student weighting, and the weighting between the sectors. We're going to provide you with some information about the rationale for how that came about.
Hey, Bill.
Yes.
President Thompson said they were ready for the presidents.
Okay, and then of course we'll discuss all the various performance metrics at our next meeting. Any questions before we sign off?
Everyone, thank you. It's good to see you, and I'll see everyone else here in a minute with Dr. Stack. Senator Gibbons, thanks. Chair Tipton, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.